Maria's hands danced over the keyboard, each keystroke adding to the detailed project proposal on her screens. The bustling office around her couldn't distract her razor-sharp focus. As a seasoned project manager, Maria prided herself on her ability to manage multiple complex tasks with precision. Yet, in her intense concentration, she hadn't noticed the time slip by. The clock now read past 7 p.m. The day had vanished in a whirlwind of meetings and deadlines. She saved her work, switched off her computer and stood up, stretching her back. Now her thoughts shifted to the calm of her home and the comfort of spending the evening with her husband, Dan. The drive home offered a much-needed reprieve from the day's pressures. Pulling into the driveway of their modest suburban home, Maria felt a wave of relief. Dan, a freelance photographer, often had irregular hours, but their evenings together were sacred, a time to reconnect and unwind. Walking into their home, Maria called out, "Dan, I'm home," but was met with silence. She paused, remembering Dan mentioned a late photo shoot. Dropping her jacket by the door, she headed towards the kitchen, thinking of grabbing a quick snack. As she passed the bathroom, a glimpse of something in the trash caught her eye. Curious, she stepped closer and saw a pregnancy test peeking out from under a pile of tissues. Her heart skipped a beat as she reached down and picked up the test. It was positive. Confusion and panic set in. Just 3 months earlier, Maria had undergone a procedure to prevent pregnancy, confident that Dan was in agreement about not having children. Leaning against the bathroom wall, her mind raced with possible explanations. Could the test be faulty? She couldn't bear the thought of any alternative explanations that involved betrayal. Pushing aside the shock, Maria decided she needed some air to clear her head. The house, filled with reminders of their shared life, suddenly felt claustrophobic. Without a second thought, she grabbed her keys and left, driving aimlessly into the night, her mind a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and hurt. Hours later, Maria returned home, her initial shock replaced by a cold resolve. She decided not to confront Dan immediately. She needed concrete evidence first. The morning sun was already brightening the sky as she woke up from a restless sleep. Pretending everything was normal, she kissed Dan goodbye, mumbling about an early meeting, and drove away only to park a block from their house. She waited until Dan left for his morning shoot, then slipped back into the silent house. It was as if the walls themselves were mocking her with their normalcy. Maria moved through each room, searching for anything, a note, a message, that might shed light on her situation. In the kitchen, she paused, straining her ears as she heard Dan's voice through the open window. He was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. "I just don't know how to tell her, Mom. It's too much. Maria has always wanted kids, and it might soften the blow," he said, his voice laced with a guilt that cut through Maria like a knife. The pieces clicked into place. All the late nights, the secretive calls, his recent emotional distance. Dan's betrayal was clear, and with it, a plan began to form in Maria's mind. With a chilling calmness, she returned to work, burying herself in her projects to keep the hurt at bay. On the surface, it seemed like an ordinary day, but beneath the facade, Maria was making decisions that would alter the course of her life. By the time she returned home, her actions were methodical and deliberate. She transferred their joint savings into a private account set up for emergencies and changed all her personal account passwords, locking Dan out completely. She packed her essentials, clothes, her laptop, important documents, and a few personal mementos. The house, once a sanctuary of their love, now felt like a strange, empty shell. Maria moved through it, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. Before leaving, she composed an email to Hannah Mitchell, the unsuspecting wife of Nolan, the man Dan had betrayed her with. The email was succinct and devoid of emotion. Attached was a photo of the positive pregnancy test. She pressed send without a moment's hesitation, her finger heavy with the finality of the action. Taking one last look around the home that had housed nearly a decade of memories, Maria felt the walls bearing down on her. She remembered the lazy Sunday mornings, the holiday gatherings, the quiet nights on the couch. With each memory, she steeled herself further, hardening her heart against the onslaught of emotions. She left the house with her belongings, locking the door behind her. She didn't look back as she drove away, leaving behind the life she had known with Dan. Hours later, Dan returned, his arms full of groceries, eager to share his news with Maria. He envisioned their future with a child, a new beginning. But as he entered the silent, empty house, a sense of dread washed over him. The house was starkly different, emptier, colder. Maria's presence, once the heart of their home, was conspicuously absent. He called out, but only his echoes answered. Panic rising, he searched the house, finding only emptiness where their life together had been. Maria's closet was bare, her drawers empty, her essence erased from their home. In the office, he found the note she had left, her words cutting deeper than he could have imagined. Dan sank to the floor, the reality of his actions crashing down around him. The life he had taken for granted was shattered, a consequence of his choices laid bare in the stark, unforgiving silence of the home they once shared. Maria sat in the dimly lit, sparse apartment she had rented after leaving the home she shared with Dan. Her laptop was open in front of her, displaying emails, bank statements, and text logs. These digital breadcrumbs painted a clear picture of Dan and Nolan's betrayal. She wasn't just looking to expose them anymore. Maria wanted their world of lies to collapse spectacularly. As she prepared for her upcoming meeting with Hannah, a notification pinged on her phone, an email from Hannah confirming the meeting time and place. Maria felt a mix of anticipation and resolve. Soon, all would be revealed, and the consequences would unravel. Elsewhere in the city, as the evening stretched on, Dan's thoughts were in turmoil. Caught between his actions and their unraveling consequences, he felt trapped. Nolan, too, was under pressure, torn between his wife Hannah and the affair with Maria. Hannah, with a steely resolve, prepared to confront the reality of her husband's infidelity, armed with the financial indiscretions she had uncovered. Maria chose a quiet cafe for the meeting. It was important that the discussion was held away from familiar eyes, in a place where they could speak freely. She arrived early, seated strategically to see the entrance. As she ordered a coffee, her hands were steady, betraying none of the storm inside her. When Hannah arrived, her composure was perfect, but her eyes were hard with a resolve that matched Maria's. They exchanged greetings, and then Hannah got straight to the point. "Maria, I appreciate this meeting, although I wish the circumstances were different," she said, her voice low and controlled. Maria nodded, understandingly. "Hannah, discovering this was as shocking for me as it must be for you. The person I thought I knew, the person I shared a life with, turned out to be a stranger," she shared, her voice steady but filled with a cold fury. Hannah listened, her own heartbreak mirrored in Maria's words. "I've been collecting evidence as well," Hannah revealed. "Financial records, late-night calls. I suspected something but didn't want to believe it." As they spoke, a plan began to form. They discussed how they would confront their respective partners, the legal implications, and the personal fallout. It was a bond forged not from friendship, but from mutual devastation, and a shared determination to not let their partner's actions define their futures. Meanwhile, back at the home she once shared with Dan, Maria's absence was palpable. Dan paced the living room, the silence a stark contrast to the life they once had. He had tried to reach Maria multiple times, to explain, to apologize, but his calls went unanswered. The weight of his choices bore down on him, the realization that he might have lost Maria for good sinking in. Dan's phone buzzed. It was Nolan. "Dan, we need to talk. It's all coming apart." Nolan's voice was strained, a mix of fear and resignation clear in his tone. Across town, Hannah braced herself as she prepared for the confrontation. She reviewed the evidence once more, each piece a stark reminder of the betrayal. The financial transactions, the intimate messages, all weaving a narrative she could no longer deny. The next day, in the quiet cafe, Maria and Hannah sat across from each other, their conversation low but intense. They shared their evidence, corroborating each other's stories, and discussed their next steps. "I can't just let him get away with this," Hannah stated firmly, her hands clenched in her lap. "I agree," Maria replied, her voice cold. "They need to understand the consequences of their actions." Back at her temporary apartment, Maria felt a momentary wave of despair. The life she had built with Dan, the memories they shared, all seemed tainted now. But as she packed up her belongings, preparing to leave that part of her life behind, a sense of empowerment began to take hold. She was taking control, no longer a victim of Dan's deceit. As she zipped up her suitcase, Maria's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. With a deep breath, she answered. It was a private investigator she had hired days earlier to gather more evidence. "Maria, you were right about everything. I have the proof you need." With the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place, Maria felt ready to face Dan and Nolan. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer alone. Hannah was with her, a newfound ally in this unexpected journey. The confrontation would be challenging, but Maria was resolute. It was time for the truth to come out, for Dan and Nolan to face the consequences of their actions. As she drove to meet Hannah, ready to finalize their plan, Maria felt a mix of anxiety and determination. Whatever happened next, she was ready to face it head-on, her integrity intact, her resolve unbreakable. In the modest living room of her apartment, Maria sat motionless, the weight of her world crushing down on her. With no job, a baby on the way, and her financial stability shattered, she felt cornered. Her mind spun as she mechanically nodded along to her mother's pragmatic yet cold advice. What other choice did she have? Across town, Dan was in his temporary apartment, finalizing his meticulous plans. He had spent the afternoon with Hannah, exchanging notes and strategizing. Now, back in his solitary space, he opened his laptop and began to draft an email to his company's HR department. He explained that he and Maria were separating due to her infidelity, requesting her immediate removal from his insurance and any other associated benefits. Next, he crafted a series of messages to their mutual friends, not delving into specifics, but clearly implying Maria's betrayal and his consequent decision to sever ties. Finally, Dan opened a new document and meticulously outlined his case for divorce, citing infidelity and financial deception. By the time he finished, a grim sense of satisfaction settled over him. The net was closing. His phone buzzed once again, another missed call from Maria. His finger hovered over the block button before he set the phone aside. He would let her stew a little longer. He'd face her soon enough. The next morning dawned bright and clear, mocking the storm brewing in their lives. Dan dressed meticulously, choosing a crisp suit that radiated confidence and control. Today was the day he would begin to dismantle Maria's world, piece by piece. His first stop was the law office of Patricia Hendricks, a formidable divorce attorney recommended by Hannah. As he laid out his case, Patricia's eyebrows rose in surprise and approval. "Mr. Carter," she said when he finished, "you've certainly done your homework. With the evidence you've gathered, we should be able to push for a swift and decisive divorce in your favor." Dan nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's exactly what I want to hear. How soon can we file?" Patricia's smile was as predatory as her reputation. "I can have the papers drawn up by this afternoon. Shall we say 3 p.m.? "Perfect," Dan replied. As he left the office, his phone buzzed with a text from Hannah. "It's done. I filed for divorce and alerted the authorities about Nolan's financial irregularities. The storm is about to break." Dan allowed himself a moment of pure vindictive pleasure. Everything was falling into place. Meanwhile, Maria's world was indeed crumbling. She woke to a flurry of messages from friends, all expressing shock and disappointment. Dan had been busy, and his messages had not gone unnoticed. Her phone rang. It was the yoga studio where she taught classes. With a sinking feeling, Maria answered. "Maria, it's Mark." Her boss's voice came through, strained and uncomfortable. "We need to talk about your position here." Maria's heart sank. "Mark, whatever you've heard, I'm sorry, Maria, but we can't have this kind of drama associated with our studio. We're going to have to let you go." The call ended abruptly, leaving Maria staring at her phone in disbelief. In just 24 hours, she had lost her husband, her lover, and now her job. What else could go wrong? A knock at the door answered her question. Maria opened it to find a courier holding out a thick envelope. "Maria Carter." At her nod, he handed her the package. "You've been served." With trembling hands, Maria opened the envelope. Inside were divorce papers. Dan was suing her for divorce on grounds of infidelity and financial deception, and he had evidence, lots of it. As she sank to the floor, papers scattered around her, Maria finally allowed herself to break down. Sobs racked her body as the full weight of her choices crashed down on her. Across town, Dan sat in his temporary office, methodically working through his projects. To his colleagues, he appeared focused and professional. No one could guess the turmoil roiling beneath the surface. His phone buzzed, a message from Maria. "Dan, please, we need to talk. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but please don't do this. I'm pregnant. We can work this out." Dan's jaw clenched as he read the message. He typed back a single line. "The child isn't mine. We both know that." He hit send and immediately blocked her number. Enough was enough. As the day wore on, reports began trickling in. Nolan Mitchell had been arrested on suspicion of financial fraud. His gym was being investigated, and clients were cancelling memberships left and right. Hannah had moved swiftly and decisively, using her connections in the real estate world to spread the word about Nolan's indiscretions. By nightfall, his reputation would be in tatters. Dan leaned back in his chair, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. Maria and Nolan's carefully constructed lives were falling apart piece by piece, but he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. As night fell, Dan drove back to the house he had shared with Maria. It was time for a confrontation, time to look her in the eye and see the realization of what she had lost. He pulled into the driveway, steeled himself, and rang the doorbell. Let Maria come to him. After a moment, the door opened. Maria stood there, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy, hair disheveled. She looked like she had aged years in a day. "Dan," she breathed, relief and fear warring in her voice. "You came back." "Not for long," he replied, his tone icy. "We need to talk." In his neatly organized office space, Dan Carter set his work aside to answer a call from Hannah Mitchell. "Dan, are you free to talk?" Her voice was tinged with restrained excitement. "Of course, Hannah. What's up?" Dan responded, his interest piqued. "It's done. The divorce is final. Nolan didn't get a penny," Hannah revealed, her voice a mixture of relief and triumph. Dan allowed himself a small smile. "Congratulations, Hannah. How do you feel?" "Relieved," she sighed, "and a little lost, to be honest. I've been so focused on taking Nolan down, I'm not sure what to do now." "I understand," Dan said softly, his voice empathetic. "But you're free now. You can start fresh." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What about you, Dan?" "How are things with Maria?" Dan's expression hardened slightly. "Moving forward, she's out of the house. The divorce should be finalized soon." "And the baby?" Hannah asked tentatively. "Not my concern," Dan stated firmly. "Maria made her bed. Now she can lie in it." After ending the call, Dan sat back, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. Nolan was ruined, both his reputation and finances in tatters. Maria was out of his life, left to face the consequences of her actions alone. He had won, so why didn't he feel victorious? Pushing the thought aside, Dan returned to his work, trying to regain his focus. He had a life to rebuild. Weeks turned into months, and Dan threw himself into his career, climbing the corporate ladder with determined focus. His personal life remained barren, but he told himself he preferred it that way. No attachments meant no chance of betrayal. It was a crisp fall morning when Dan's carefully constructed new life faced its first real test. He was leaving his favorite coffee shop, briefcase in one hand and latte in the other, when a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. Dan. He turned slowly, coming face to face with Maria. She looked different, thinner, paler, with dark circles under her eyes. Her hand rested protectively on her swollen belly. For a moment, neither spoke. The busy street faded away, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of shared history and pain. Maria broke the silence first. How are you?" Dan's grip tightened on his coffee cup. "Fine," he said curtly. "You?" Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I'm managing, Dan." He cut her off before she could continue. "Whatever you're going to say, I don't want to hear it." He made to move past her, but Maria's next words stopped him cold. "The baby's a girl," she said softly. "I'm naming her Lily after your grandmother." Dan felt like he'd been punched in the gut. His grandmother Lily had been the only real family he'd had growing up. Maria knew how much she had meant to him. He turned back, anger flaring. "You don't get to do that," he hissed. "You don't get to use my family to try and manipulate me." Maria flinched. "That's not what I'm doing. I wanted you to know." "No?" Dan's voice was rising, drawing curious glances from passers-by. "That you're using my grandmother's name for a child that isn't even mine? A child you conceived while betraying everything we built together?" Tears were flowing freely down Maria's cheeks now. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, Dan was transported back to happier times, lazy Sunday mornings, playful banter over breakfast, the warmth of Maria's smile. But the memory was tainted now, poisoned by betrayal. He took a deep breath, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Your apologies mean nothing to me, Maria. You made your choice. Now live with it." With that, he turned and walked away, ignoring Maria's broken sobs behind him. His coffee had gone cold, but he barely noticed. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions he'd thought long buried. Back at his office, Dan found it impossible to focus. The encounter with Maria had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He was just considering calling it a day when his phone rang. It was Hannah. "Dan, are you okay? You sound off." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I ran into Maria today." "Oh, how did that go?" Hannah's voice was gentle. "About as well as you'd expect," Dan said dryly. "She's very pregnant." "And how do you feel about that?" Hannah's voice was full of concern. Dan was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Part of me wants to hate her, to hate that child. But part of me still cares." Hannah finished for him. "Yeah, Dan, I guess you do." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Finally, Hannah spoke again. "Dan, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy?" The question caught him off guard. I don't know. Are you—" Hannah's laugh was soft, a little sad. "I'm getting there. It's not easy, but I'm learning to live for myself again. Not for Nolan, not for revenge, just for me." Her words struck a chord in Dan. When was the last time he'd done something purely for himself, not out of anger or a desire for retribution? "Maybe," he said slowly. "Maybe it's time I tried that too." As he hung up the phone, Dan felt something shift inside him. The anger that had been driving him for so long began to be replaced by a tentative hope. Not for reconciliation with Maria, that bridge was well and truly burned, but for a future where he wasn't defined by her betrayal.